Cheesley. I'm a psychotherapist and an executive performance coach. I work in the intersection of emotional health, identity development, and leadership psychology. I help high functioning professionals understand their inner architecture that drives their decisions and relationships and their sense of self. So, today we're going to talk about something that sits at the center of leadership effectiveness, emotional regulation, and strategic clarity. Something I like to frame as signal versus noise. If you followed my work around inner architecture and strategic alignment, this is the bridge between the two. Because here's the reality. Most leaders don't fail because of a lack of information. They fail because they misread what matters. They confuse the signal with noise. And when that happens, strategy destabilizes. So let's define this more clearly. Signal is information that is meaningful and it meaningfully impacts direction, risk, performance, or culture. Noise is emotionally amplified. That's the ego-driven stuff, the reactivity, the reactive political, the distorted input that feels urgent but does not change the strategy. And so the problem isn't volume, the problem is filtration. Your inner architecture determines what you hear. Every leader operates through a psychological filter. Your insecurities, your attachment patterns, your identity fusion, your sensitivity to status, your need for control, those shape what feels urgent. And so two leaders can hear the same input. One hears data, one hears threat. The difference is not intelligence, it's inner architecture. If your internal system is dysregulated, noise sounds like signal. If your internal system is stable, signal becomes clearer. Leadership is filtration before it is decision making. So some common ways that leaders distort signal. So let me outline 5 distortions that I typically see with my leadership management teams. So one is ego amplification. An operational critique becomes a personal threat. You overcorrect to protect identity. Anxiety inflation. A minor variance feels like a crisis. You escalate urgency unnecessarily. Avoidant minimization. Subtle warning signs are dismissed because they are uncomfortable. So you underreact to real signal. Political overweighting. The loudest voice gets disproportionate influence. Volume replaces validity. Happens a lot in meetings. And then the last one is legacy bias. New data is filtered out because it threatens prior decisions. So you protect the past instead of adjusting to the future. None of these are strategic problems. They are all psychological distortions. They're all noise. So what happens when leaders confuse signal with noise? Well, when noise is treated as signal, the strategy is going to be off, the teams are going to lose clarity, priorities get shifted, maybe daily, weekly, monthly. The emotional tone tends to be reactive. There's more decision fatigue. And I think your highest performers tend to disengage. The organization, the teams, the direct reports, they feel a sense of instability as well as you. Not because the environment or the market is unstable, but because the leadership filtration is unstable and there's a trickle-down effect, which is noise-driven leadership, essentially. And that produces this chronic urgency without progress, without clear signal. So what does clear signal look like? Leaders with regulated inner architecture are going to respond differently. They're going to ask inner questions like, does this materially impact our direction? For themselves, they may ask, is this my own emotional amplification, or is this true data? And what is urgent and what is simply loud? And they're also going to question, what is my reaction about this change? Or is it really about me? So clear signals will often produce a sense of calibrated urgency. There's more stable communication. There's more focus. There's less friction. And there's a strategic endurance throughout. Signal-driven leaders don't move fast. They actually move cleaner. So, signal versus noise in the C-suite. Let's talk a bit about that. So at executive levels, the volume increases dramatically. There's board pressure, market volatility, talent overturn. There's a lot of environmental changes, right? So everything feels like a signal, but it isn't. It's more, so mature executives, they develop what I call regulatory filtration. And so they slow down before reacting. They observe emotional tone, including their own, and they're able to differentiate the structural risk, the cultural erosion, tactical friction, ego threat. And so if your nervous system cannot tolerate ambiguity, you will overreact to noise. And the overreaction ultimately destabilizes alignment. So what is the organizational cost to noise? So when teams see leaders reacting impulsively, they're going to adapt. They'll start filtering what they bring up forward. They may exaggerate to get attention. They may withhold bad news. They may hedge decisions. And so now the system produces more noise, and leadership reacts ultimately the same. And so that feedback loop erodes trust. And so signal clarity isn't just analytical, it is cultural. And so signal requires identity stability. So here's the uncomfortable truth. If your identity is fused to being right, you will ignore signals that contradict you. If your identity is fused to being needed, you will amplify noise to stay central. If your identity is fused in performance, you will treat every dip as existential. Signal discernment requires ego containment. And that's why inner architecture precedes strategic alignment. So without internal regulation, strategy is going to become emotionally hijacked, right? So here's the diagnostic questions, right? So when someone lands or something lands on your desk, right, you ask yourself in this, like, is this a directional threat? Is this a structural risk? Is this cultural erosion? Or is it an emotional spike, political maneuver, a perceived issue, or a temporary variance, right? So signal changes trajectory. Noise changes mood. So leaders must know the difference. Signal versus noise. And most importantly, and just as important, noise in leadership transition can show up. This becomes critical during succession, essentially. So outgoing leaders may treat their loss of centrality as signal. It's not. It's identity adjustment. And so incoming leaders may treat resistance as a signal of incompetence. Sometimes it's just noise from the system essentially recalibrating. And without clear filtration, transitions destabilize unnecessarily. Signal says, is performance eroding? And noise says, they don't like the change. Those are not the same thing. So the clear distinction is that signal requires clarity, noise demands reaction. Signal will stabilize the system. Noise destabilizes them. Signal strengthens alignment, and noise creates churn. The ability to distinguish the two is not just strategic, it is psychological maturity in action. So before we close, there are three reflection questions I'd like to pose. When you feel urgency, is it data-driven or emotion-driven? Second question, do you overreact to visible friction and underreact to subtle cultural drifts? Third question, if you reduced your reactivity by 20, 30%, would your strategic clarity increase? Because the most effective leaders are not the most informed. They are the most filtered. And so if this live resonates with you, particularly for my executives, founders, managers, leadership teams, I explore signal versus noise more deeply within broader frameworks of my inner architecture and strategic alignment, which I often talk about on my YouTube and LinkedIn channel. Because strategy fails less from lack of intelligence and more from psychological distortion. And when your internal filtration is clear, alignment becomes durable. I'll see you next time.